Today we're looking at co-regulation and how this leads to self-regulation. We can't talk about co-regulation, self-regulation rather, without talking about how we support children to develop the ability to regulate themselves. We have to co-regulate with our children. Oops, flying through my slides. So this session, we're going to look at what we know, how to make the research-informed choices, how to improve our practice, building strong, warm, meaningful relationships, seeing that as the bedrock to everything that we do. And this is something that you all do quite naturally, but it's great to know that the research supports that this is a great way forward. So every time we do a training and we're looking at research, we are merging that with practice that we know, that we are familiar with. We're not blindly following research, we're being research informed. So these sessions are to help you reflect on your practice and see where you can make tweaks. And then in the conversations you have with your visitors, with any professionals who come to your setting, you can talk about being research informed. So yes, we need to notice where those gaps are for our children and address those. So if we look at the approaches in the evidence store for PSED, the second approach is incredibly linked to self-regulation, the teaching and modeling of managing emotions and feelings. How we do that is really important because that is going to make a huge difference. So when we're managing emotions, we model this with our children using those wonderful Shrek approaches of sharing attention, building that trusting relationship. And then once we have that trusting relationship, we can demonstrate to the children how they can move and shift from one emotion to another through questioning, through responding. And the starting point for this will be to recognize how the child is feeling, to name it quite explicitly. I can see some of us here are doing the early emotions, and that's very much about naming the emotions that the children are feeling, showing them emotions that they might not have encountered, and really show those in our faces so that they can see what that generally would look like in terms of expression. Talk about how that might make our bodies feel. Oops, there we go. So when we're doing that, we will also find moments in the moment of being in our free play, or whether we're in a little session and the children have had a little disagreement, maybe in the moment, we will use different prompts to help the child overcome the difficulty that they've come across. They might freeze because something suddenly seems really overwhelming for them, or they may get really angry. And the adult then offers physical, visual, and verbal prompts in these real situations, and might refer them to a technique like a breathing technique, or perhaps it might be to use two simple words together where they have limited vocabulary to help them with the next stage. Here a child's encountered an obstacle, children sitting in his way, and he's not really sure how to ask them to get past. So the practitioner is reminding him how he can use his two words that he's been practicing. Excuse me. And here we're showing a practitioner who's supporting some children with sharing out some objects. Children who ordinarily might have snatched them and she's alongside them, showing them how to do this. And then hopefully in time, they will be able to do this quite harmoniously without the adult present. So to be able to do this, when we can preempt that a child is going to have some difficulty, or maybe that difficulty has already started, it's really important that we're aware of our own energy, our own motivations, and for us to be able to help the child be calm, we're going to need to make sure that we're really calm. So co-regulation definitely starts with children being aware of what those feelings are that they have, naming what is going on with their reactions, being self-aware, developing that self-awareness, recognizing feelings not only in themselves, but in others, or maybe in a storybook, what the characters are starting to feel. And we need to avoid asking the children to not cry or not feel certain emotions. I love saying, it's okay to cry. Come on, let's get it out. Shall I cry with you? Really allowing that and allowing other children to see that. There are some children who might have been asked to suppress their crying, but actually there's a time for them to do that. Of course, I'm not talking about the children who use crying as a means of communication, not for distress, not for hurt, but perhaps for I'm here and these are the sounds that I know. Of course, in that case, we need to help the child shift over to using some direct language or some expressions or gestures. Acknowledge and support, don't suppress. That's the idea. And be really mindful that you're matching your emotion to the emotion that you're talking about. I'm sorry, I mean your expression. So that your expression is not contradictory to the emotion that you're talking about. We don't want to reinforce misconceptions. Some children find it really hard to make certain expressions. And some children, we need to accept they're not going to make certain expressions with their faces because it's not the way that they express themselves. And we need to be aware of how to read them. Some children look very serious all the time, but express their happiness through a gesture that they do with their hands or through jumping up and down. So, some of the elements of co-regulation are noticing the expression and the behavior, offering a technique to calm down. So you're doing this alongside the child. You might be using deep breaths or pushing a wall, squeezing a toy, punching a cushion, or ripping up a cardboard box if you've been given permission to rip up something. Important that we are not saying anything goes. There are limits. We need to reinforce, reinforce that we have to be careful of our environment. We're not in the business of breaking things. We need to make sure that the actions that we do are not hurting anybody. That is an absolute boundary. We're not being permissive here. We're recognizing that you're cross. You can express that you're cross by doing this, this, and this. But everybody here needs to be safe, and everything in this environment needs to not be broken. It needs to be whole. It needs to be looked after. It's really tricky, even as I model it now, to avoid using negative language such as no. We know a lot of our children experience no a lot. And so that might be something that we hear a lot from them. It might all be no, 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 no. Well, if that's what they've heard a lot, that's one of the ways that they know how to communicate. So we need to be really mindful of adapting our language so that they copy what we would like from them. So if a child is dysregulated, that is not the time to try and unpick complex situation. They need to go through their dysregulation alongside us. We might support them to get to the next phase. But we need to be patient with that. We can't push them to that next stage until they're actually ready. But through breathing or movement or squishing, or even just putting pressure on the shoulder, some children respond really well to that. Then once they're calm, they might be able to express more fully what's happened. So if we look at the self-regulation and executive function evidence store materials, we can see that there are 5 approaches that are recommended. So these are all summaries from all the educational research that is out there that is applicable to early years. So creating and navigating challenge, teaching self-monitoring and self-awareness, creating a community of collaborative learners. I think I've switched those round in my slides. Promoting physical activity, and also metacognition, which is otherwise known as promoting talking about learning. So we're going to have a look at those 5 different approaches and how they might look. So creating and navigating challenge is about making sure that we're noticing whether our children are getting bored, really being mindful that we have enough challenge in our environment, we have enough challenge in the resources that we're providing, and we're providing enough challenge with our comments and our possible questioning. Often we can provide quite a bit of challenge with our I wonder statements. I wonder if we might be able to create a tunnel with the sand. We really want to be in the business of avoiding having bored children. So that's why we need to observe exactly where they're at and just have something a little bit out of reach that they will aspire to have a go at. So here the children have been making sand pits, sand castles using buckets, a very simple method of turning it out, tapping it, lifting off the bucket. Wow, I've got my sand castle. They'd been doing this for quite some time. And they'd been knocking them over, and they'd been breaking them and building them, making larger ones. But it was time to introduce them to something new. So this is how it had started. I mentioned that perhaps if they had worked together, they might be able to make an even bigger mountain, even bigger than the sandcastles they'd created. And the reason I posed that challenge was because this was a group of children who found it quite hard to collaborate. So you might have a group of 3 or 4 children, or a larger group that you're wanting to encourage to work together. And the I wonder was enough to get them really excited to go and find the spades that they'd need to get them digging. They were quite nice big spades, so they could really get their back into it. And then once that was built, that was when we asked them whether they might be able to create a tunnel. Was there any way that they could have one child on one side, one child on the other, and actually touch each other's hands through a tunnel? How do you think we might be able to do that? And this is just an example of one of the challenges that we posed that actually was really fruitful in getting them interested in using the sand differently. For weeks, they were all having a go at making these tunnels through the sand. And in the previous picture, you can probably see that we have, if you've got a big enough screen, we had put little bits of wood across to make some bridges and shown them how they could press the sand like so to make a really thin looking bridge just going across it. So a little example of how you can manipulate the slightly damp sand differently. And if you were in a little group situation, you might have a little mathematical challenge that the children are quite excited about being involved in. If you've got numerals and you've got the counters and you've got a die, there you've got yourself a really simple little game where the children can access it at their level. They might be accessing it to roll the die, notice what amount that is because they're already subitizing, find that amount of counters, find the right place to put those counters, and there you've been able to assess, oh my gosh, this child's got one-to-one correspondence, this child's got the recognition of the numeral. There's so much you can do in there. But they were all so invested in participating in this because it was quite an exciting little game. And then you had the child who didn't have many counting skills, who was at the initial stage, but they still felt included because they could count along the number line to work out their numeral. They could count the dots on the die to work out how many that represented. And they had a group who could count out the counters with them to support their count. So although it can look quite challenging, it is actually really accessible for the child with fewer skills. So that's just a little example of another type of challenging activity to encourage the children to participate. And here at the bottom of the evidence store for this looking at challenge, introducing challenge, you've got the posing problems, providing opportunities, and then reminding. These are little snippets of the video showing you very clearly some particular practices that this adult is using. So Rachel is getting the children to really think through how they're going to find worms on such a cold, snowy day. The earth is really hard. What are we going to do? Is there a way we can warm it up? And so she's got the children to really think about what they're going to do next. That act of posing a question to them that is really quite interesting naturally makes them stop and have that focus time and that thinking, and it really develops their executive functions. So when you're creating a community of collaborative learners, you need to go back to that idea of co-regulation, where an adult will sensitively participate in the activity of some children. And in this example, we've got two children who had very few words. One had developmental delay, the other was EAL, speaking only another language. And so they were quite snatchy whenever they used a resource. Whereas here, the adult was able to support them with using very simplified language to ask to take a turn. She could introduce marble, please, so that the children could then attend to each other and respond to each other. So hopefully next time they'd attempt using those simplified phrases with each other, avoiding the snatching. And another example of an adult playing alongside the children is introducing something like a board game, which is really nice to do in a home setting. It's very comfortable. The smaller the group, the less time you need to wait for your turn, which means that the children might sustain the game for a little bit longer. Sometimes when we've played such games like snakes and ladders, the children might just take 2 turns and then move on to something else, but they're gradually building their tolerance for waiting for their turn. The more excited we are about it, the more invested they are in taking part. And then eventually they start saying, oh, I need to get the snakes and ladders out. Who's going to play snakes and ladders with me today? And then lo and behold, you see they are leading that game by themselves, and they're demonstrating really good executive functions. They're waiting their turn. They're being collaborative. They're noting when somebody's missing a turn. A really lovely activity to be doing, very simple. Another thing we can do is suggest to the children that they do something collaboratively. How about we collect some mud? That could be really useful, because this group over here wanted to make some mud paint. So if you guys collect the mud, we could go over there and dish it out into their separate buckets. What do you think about that? Oh yeah, I want to go and collect mud. Again, we've got our spades out, and there we are digging for mud. Really simple activity you can do in a corner of your garden if you have a mucky area, or if you've taken buckets out to a forest school, or whether you're out and about in a playground where there's a little bit of a rough patch. It's something you might be able to do quite easily. I think it's quite a portable idea. And then hopefully this will lead to independent collaboration. So here is an image where they then did share out this mud, and a group of children who were quite flighty and finding it difficult to focus and maybe not showing much interest in some of the activities, actually were incredibly interested in this idea of making paint from this mud that you can just find in a corner. What an easy thing to do. So this idea of breaking activities right down often lends itself to children attending to, participating, wanting to take part in each little stage of the journey. So rather than having paint ready to do some outdoor painting, which is fine, it's a lovely thing to do, you might sometimes break that down and actually make the paint from powder. You might make 2 different types of paint from powder, and then you might have a third pot where you might discover another colour. And how lovely for the children to make that discovery, rather than us show them straight away that blue and yellow is going to make a new colour. So vocabulary that's nice to use. What seems to be happening now? Getting the children really thinking it through. How exciting for them to have actually made the perfect consistency of paint. At that stage, they said, oh, okay, we want to see what this paint looks like. And they went off, found some paper from their indoor space, handed it out, organized themselves. And you could see this is something that they might replicate another time. They've had a little bit of support from adults suggesting things here and there. Next time, they might take it upon themselves to do this all by themselves. And the sense of pride, ta-da, this is the painting that I created with my mud paint that we made together. And there's also this lovely sense of collaborative success. And it was a really lovely moment where they then took this on, and for days they were doing the same activity. We then have to think about what next when that activity starts becoming a little bit boring to them. So in the research, they were looking at block play specifically and pretend play. And what the adults were doing is they were encouraging the children to be self-directed, encouraging them to plan, to problem solve, and to negotiate together. And this is one of the videos that I found really lovely, because Becky is working with a couple of children here. One of them seems to have had quite some difficulty with using the resources delicately and perhaps knocking other people's things over. And here the practitioner is really sensitively showing the child how to work alongside and with the other child. So it's well worth having a look at that. So doing all of these things has been found to support children's executive functions, particularly their working memory. So when you're slowing an activity down, you're slowing the thinking process down, which means you're having to hold thoughts, and that supports the working memory. So when we're teaching the self-monitoring and the self-awareness, which is also one of the approaches, you might be teaching simple breathing techniques. A lot of the research was based on teaching yoga and teaching mindfulness, but they're very aware that all of us teach different approaches, but all of these are very effective in teaching self-awareness. So when we bring attention to the breath, we're bringing awareness to our bodies. And then we start bringing awareness to how we breathe when we feel different emotions, and how it's useful to slow down that breath when we get very worked up. So teaching our children what the physical sensations are, the thoughts that we have, the feelings that we have, and how those things interconnect. This all helps with executive function. And another, which is really important, and if you've met me before, you know it's very dear to me, physical activity underpins so much of our children's development. In their earliest years, everything is being developed through physicality. This carries on. And the research has shown that if we encourage physicality, we are then enabling our children to be able to better focus. So it really does have a direct link with focus and being able to attend to things. And here is an example of children who had found it quite tricky to be quite careful in their very physical play. So they liked rough and tumble. So we had chosen to show them ways to do breakdancing type moves, ways to do very challenging jumps, and ways to do non-contact karate type movements. And that was really very interesting for them to participate in, and it shifted their need to be really risky in their very close contact physical play. You have to make that call as the practitioner, whether you feel they're safe enough. One of the things that I think is incredibly unsafe is when children are lying on their back and they kick upwards. That's something that we have to teach them really quite quickly to control, because our largest muscle in our body is in our buttocks. And so our legs are incredibly strong when we kick upwards like that. And to really explicitly explain that to our children. So the last, well, the final one that is in those 5 approaches that are recommended, promoting talk about learning, is in there. And here we've got a practitioner who's talking about different shapes, and she's using a text to talk about that. So they're recalling what they know already about shapes. They might know that they have particular features. They may have been handling different shapes to notice how many corners they have, how many sides they have, and they might be referring back to things that they were doing the previous day or earlier on in the day. And a lovely thing to do is also at the end of the day to just go through the things that they've learned. And the children can surprise you talking about the things that were really significant to them. They might come up with something that was maybe not the thing that you'd planned for that day, and something that just happened quite naturally on a walk, or an animal that they saw at the park. Those significant things that they learned are really important for us to build on and to go back to. So effective practice in talking about learning are really things like thinking aloud, reading stories, recalling what happened in those stories, or perhaps doing interactive reading where the child is noticing what's happening in the illustrations, and giving children feedback. So letting them know that you noticed the things they were doing that day. It may have been really busy and they may not have seen that you saw their lovely painting that they'd done earlier. I really enjoyed watching how you made paint from mud, and I saw that you even made a painting to take home from it. You might have noticed how they finally managed to get their coat on independently. I noticed how you using the upside down method for putting on your coat. You did it really well today. That was great. Or a child who remembered to use the toilet in time, and you've been working on that, and what a wonderful thing that you got there in time. Very careful to do that sort of congratulations in front of a group, only if that child is really secure and not going to feel a little bit embarrassed by the situation. That is your professional call to make. So my last image here is of me in the outdoors, because I am a lover of the outdoors. And I have to say that over the years, I have noticed that children who have really struggled with their own ability to self-regulate, perhaps their impulses or their ability to attend to, are transformed when they're in the garden, when they're in that natural environment, and you draw attention to the wonderful things that are happening around them. Most children suddenly seem to have that ability to focus and notice and observe deeply. Here it was a little bit of a spring walk, noticing the signs of spring, going around, and eventually the children were all free to wander around once they felt confident in that space. And that gave time for the practitioner to have lots of really nice interactions with them. And it was very collaborative as well. A lovely opportunity to, at the end, all come together and discuss what we'd enjoyed. So here are some useful resources that I've referred to. So the EEF resources are the second and, well, the third and fourth. And the reason I've put in the early child development training there is because I really urge everyone to sign on to that. All the modules are amazing. They don't go out of date. There is a lovely module on personal, social, and emotional development that includes self-regulation. And the first two resources I've put there are wonderful little booklets from family, and these are free to access. And if you click on them now, you will be you'll be opening them in a new tab. So you might want to do that now, or when you receive the slides, you can have a little look. Really nice resources to refer back to. And I'd like to thank you very much for